Hi, I'm Reid Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. Thanks for listening today and trusting Grief Refuge as a resource to help cope with your loss and navigate your grief. I'd like to personally welcome you, whether this is your first time listening or if you've heard my voice before. Grief Refuge is about providing daily support to help you find peace and purpose after experiencing a death-related loss. This podcast was created with the intention to help validate everything that you're going through, to help you take time to reflect, and to help you honor your loved one. Here at Grief Refuge, you will learn healthy ways to manage grief. You can also find comfort, hopefulness, and a sense of peace in regards to your loss, as well as finding a way to embrace life and move forward again. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to help you work through the heavier, more painful feelings that go hand in hand with grief. Grieving can really hurt, and it can be really hard to manage. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything that I can to provide the best support to you. Before we begin, I want to mention a couple important points. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and your personal reflection. Please use this time to settle in and relax, and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. If anything, please use this time to mourn your loss. Also, this podcast publishes episodes once or twice a month. So when you're grieving, that's a lot of time in between each episode, and you may need more resources to feel more supported. So if you're in a place of needing more support right now, please download the Grief Refuge app. The Grief Refuge app helps provide comfort and support on a daily basis. On the Grief Refuge app, there's what we call daily mini podcasts, and these daily mini podcasts help validate your grief. They provide some tools for coping, and they also offer perspective when you're grieving. These mini podcasts help you sort through the thoughts and the feelings that come up when you're dealing with loss and grief. The Grief Refuge app is really easy to find. All you have to do is search for Grief Refuge on your phone's app store. You can download it there for free, and please download it now to get started. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. I have a direct question for you. Are you tired of people trying to fix your grief? Or are you tired of people judging you for feeling a certain way? If so, you're in the right place, because you're going to want to listen to this podcast episode and this conversation with my guest, Stephenie Zamora. In just a moment, you're going to hear Stephenie and myself discuss the ways of grief's, what she calls, dark and twisty, and how it can overwhelm someone experiencing loss and not knowing who they are right now or who they're going to be when they actually get through part of their process and they get their grief bearings down. What I love about this conversation is it's truly authentic. I also hope that it helps you put your own loss into words. It helps you feel heard and understood. And it gives you some insights into the deeper and darker experiences and emotions of the grief experience. Things like feeling disoriented, having guilt, feeling rage, being reckless, etc. Please enjoy this special conversation with Stephenie. Hey, everyone listening. Thank you so much for being a part of Grief Refuge. I'm actually really excited today to have this wonderful conversation with our guest, Stephenie Zamora. Stephenie, I
I'm really intrigued with what you have to share in our conversation today. And at the same time, before we started this conversation, you actually told me that you love working with people in the dark and twisty. Can you help define what twisty means to you?
Yes, that's actually just the way I have always described my deepest depths, whether that was when I was an angsty, existential, didn't understand the point of life, suicidal teenager, or when I was in the depths of my grief and trauma, or when I've just been like at different rock bottoms throughout my life. And that was kind of how I could describe how it felt to be at the bottom of myself. It was just like dark and twisty, like the angsty twisting around and like wrestling with yourself and your demons and your darkness and your grief and your trauma. So that's how I describe the experience.
Appreciate that. Well, we quickly learned that you're a very authentic person and you're in the right place for a meaningful conversation. And I'm grateful you reached out. I so look forward to learning more about everything that you teach because it seems like a lot. I'll be honest with you. I'm like, this young woman has a lot of wisdom and I really want to learn from her. And so don't hold back, okay?
Okay, you got it.
All right. Well, let's just start to get to know you a little bit, please. Tell us a little bit about the area you live in and, what you call home.
Yes, I actually just moved back home to Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I grew up here and I left for 20 years. And I felt the call a couple of years before I actually made the move to just go home. Like there's so much color and culture and family here and great food. So I came home in March of this year, 2022, and I actually came home with the intention to really change the direction of my life. I realized when I was living in Colorado, which is where I was before, that I didn't want a typical life anymore. I really wanted to move towards living off grid, having my own little plot of land and doing homesteading and self-sustaining and even having a retreat center that people could come to and work the land eventually. And so when I was looking at apartments and places to rent when I was moving, I just felt in my gut like I can't sign another lease. Like it feels so misaligned to me to do that, and got the inspiration to live in a camper. So in July, I actually bought a fifth wheel camper, which is parked on family property, and I'm getting the inside repainted to move into. But that's a fun little tidbit about me and where I am is I'm in New Mexico and I'm about to move into a camper to start my little off-grid living dream.
That sounds really cool. It's getting to be what sounds like a little bit more common these days. I actually hear about people watching YouTube videos of other people, setting up campers, or I don't even know the right terminology, so forgive me in the assumptions, but like tiny home living,
Yes.
homesteading, and things like that. There's a there's a big interest by a lot of people in our country that just want to simplify life. And was that part of your decision making too? I know you wanted to be closer to family and you didn't want to miss out on the great food, but was there kind of this aspect of
Yes.
simplifying your life?
I had a very strong and probably strange desire to not only simplify, but to live a more inconvenient life. And that's actually something that took me to the mountains where I was before in the first place. And I really think that it was about building a different relationship to myself and challenging myself in new ways and proving a whole variety of things to myself, that I could trust myself, that I could learn new skills, that I could change my life and live the life I really wanted, despite the fact that it's never looked like that before. But I really enjoyed purging before this move, knowing that I was going to be living in guest rooms until I'm in the camper, and knowing that the camper is not huge and I don't plan on traveling around in it. That's not something that I want to do, but I will be in this tiny camper, for quite a while. And so I sold and donated like 90% of my things. And I would say about a third of what I have left is actually books. But it felt so good to actually go through everything. And I described this experience that I was going through as reducing my life to zero. Like I wanted to strip away anything and everything that didn't feel like me anymore, that wasn't absolutely necessary for my life or my happiness or my business. And I felt energetically and emotionally lighter in doing that. And it felt so good to find all these things, because we accumulate so much stuff, and to find all this stuff from old relationships or old ways of being or old periods of my life, and just bless it and send it off to someone else, or finally take it to the dumpster. And so, yeah, simplifying. And it's taught me over the last 9 months since I've moved here, how little I actually need to be happy and to live my life.
Fantastic. I'm happy to hear that. Have to ask, as far as the books that you decided to keep, what was one of them that you looked at and you said, there's no way I'm going to throw this away or
It's so
donate it?
funny. I love that question because it's actually, oh, what is her name? It's the author of The Writer's Way, Julia Cameron. So Julia Cameron has a memoir that, and I forget what it's called right now, but it's all about her life and journey into becoming herself and building her body of work and writing her books. And I had read this memoir like many years ago, and I actually gave it away in a book exchange that I went to, and I regretted it. And I'm not someone who, there's a certain handful of books that I'll reread, but books like that, I don't usually reread. I remember what's important to me. And I was so devastated by not having it that I bought a copy of it again. And it has sat on my bookshelf for years, but it's almost like, it's like a security blanket in some way, or it's like, it reminds me of a part of myself and I can't bear to let it go. So I'll never read it again, but that's one that I kept.
It sounds like a nice anchor as far as helping hold this concrete definition of who Stephenie is.
Yes.
It's really cool. Interesting that it's about, I can't remember if the title is The Writer's Way or if it's something related to that. Forgive me, short-term memory loss, folks. But I will say, also pre-interview, you had shared a bit about me that like writing is such a big part of your life. And so has that book influenced your writing?
Definitely. One of her main concepts in that book is called morning pages, which is essentially journaling by hand, like, and not stopping. So you fill like 3 full sheets of paper completely and you don't stop, and you do it by hand to slow yourself down. Even if all you have to say is, I don't know what to write anymore, this is dumb, I don't want to do this anymore, you keep yourself in motion. And so that's part of my personal morning practice and routine that makes me feel really grounded, is I write at least 3 full pages longhand, and I just empty out what's in my mind and I allow whatever needs to come through. And sometimes I am frustrated and I write about how dumb this practice is. But and she's known for that, among other things. But writing every morning just keeps me sane.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. I'm going to take a big jump, but forgive me. I am so curious if there's grief that you've experienced in your life, and did you utilize the tool of writing to help process and work through your grief?
Yeah. So my big grief, and there was a lot of grief after that, was 2014. I ended a 2-year relationship and he ended up committing suicide after stalking me for a couple weeks, and 2 days after I asked him to leave me alone. And that completely unraveled me. It absolutely flattened me. It left me with PTSD. And it was very intense, all-consuming grief. And because I had, I think, such a long practice of writing, both in journaling and both in creating content online, it was very natural for me to process it publicly. And I didn't do it with any intention. It wasn't a marketing strategy. It was literally something that I felt compelled to do. And I think I did a fairly decent job. What's important to me with writing is that I don't share things that are unproductive or aren't clean. So if I'm really in something, I might write about it, but I won't necessarily put it out into the world. And so there was a lot of things that I wrote for myself that ended up going into places or books later. And there was a lot of stuff I wrote in my journal, but I started sharing about my experience with processing the grief and figuring out who I was in the aftermath and all the things that I was learning and all the ways I was handling what was coming undone. And it was very healing for me to give words to the experience, because I am somebody who, I feel very intensely. I feel a lot all the time, even when I was happy and felt whole and complete before my loss, really just like ripped me open. And so it was just very healing to be able to describe and find the words, even just for myself, of what it felt like every step of the process, and to share the lessons that I was learning. And again, not from a place of especially in the beginning, it wasn't from a place of, oh, I want to be recognized for this, or oh, this will help my business, or whatever. It was just like I had to put my lessons out there. And it was more so for me really than anyone else. And even in the years that followed, because it took quite a while for me to really heal and come back from that loss, to see my own words pop up were such a great comfort. Like every December, in the beginning of December, because December is the month of my loss, there's a post that comes up that is such a comfort for me that I never remember unless I'm thinking about it in a conversation like this, or until it pops up of, I always feel a bit off at the beginning of December. And so my own words will come up and they will remind me of why, and they will bring me comfort, and they will help me see how far I've come. So yeah, it was one of those instinctual things for me after loss, was to just put it into words.
Okay. And in putting it into words, it sounds like a lot of that, or portions of that, was shared publicly, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like, in a public format, what kind of feedback did you get as you shared more of your grief journey?
It was really interesting. A lot of the people, and I know a lot of people experience this with grief just in their relationships without even putting their experience online in writing. But a lot of the people who were a part of my life before my loss really fell away. Like the people that would have engaged with my posts before, crickets, they were nowhere to be found. But I really, like I said, was in such a space that I wasn't doing it for any reason than I needed to. And so I noticed, but it didn't deter me in any way. And the more that I wrote about it, the more I actually started connecting to people that resonated with what I was sharing, because I do think one of my skills, which comes from me just being so emotional and having a relationship with my dark and twisty, like I am pretty good at describing feelings and experiences. And so there were people that started saying like, wow, you gave words to what I'm going through, or who would start reaching out to me and sharing their own experience. And you and I talked a bit before recording about isolation. And so there was something really healing and comforting in that, despite being so incredibly uncomfortable and in pain and feeling very isolated at the same time. Like there's so much duality with grief. There was something that was comforting about, oh yeah, I'm not the only one who's going through this, who's inside this devastation and this turmoil and this confusion and this anger and this sadness and guilt and all these things. And that has continued, as I've come back into my life and my work, and I still write, and I write differently. Like there's something comforting, and it's a struggle to even use the word comfort, because when people are like, I totally get that, thank you for saying that, I feel the same way, here's what I went through. Like there's this part of me that's like, oh my gosh, like I get it. And we have this connection now, and I feel for you and you feel for me. And I also feel really heartbroken that when people understand what I'm sharing, because it means that they've gone through something similar.
In the process of sharing publicly, and then recognizing some of like how this has helped in your healing journey, was there anything that you found yourself continuing to long for?
Can you expand on that? Long for?
Was there anything that you still felt like there was a gap, like wasn't unfulfilling or wasn't fulfilling you? You still needed more of blank. Was there anything?
Yeah, definitely. There was, again, the isolation of it, the duality. The experience was very confusing for me, because I was finding comfort and recognition and connection with certain people, and yet there was still such a gap everywhere else. Like there were a lot of people in my immediate circles, family and friends, that could not, for whatever reasons, hold space for what I was going through. And so while I was building new relationships and connections, and some of which ultimately became like my inner closest circle, at the time, those people were new to my world. And the people that were familiar, that were my go-to people, that were my closest friends and connections, were falling away. And not only were they falling away and not understanding what I was going through, but there was that expectation, which I think every griever has experienced, that we get over it quickly, that there should be some kind of timeline. And I had people literally say to me, like in response to seeing me writing and sharing even, don't you just want to forget about it by now? Like, I would think that you would want to move on. Why are you dwelling on it? Why are you like spinning around in it? And so the very thing that was creating more connection and helping me feel like I wasn't the only one at the same time was like actively pushing away and repelling the people that had been there before. So the duality piece was so mind-bending to me that I could feel connected and all alone at the same time, that I could feel understood and like people were making me wrong for my process and what I was going through. So there was a craving for a lot of things and a desire for a lot of things, but it felt like my experience of grief was like the ground just shifted beneath my feet instantaneously in my case. And when the ground shifts beneath your feet, like your center of gravity shifts with it. And so all of a sudden you're off balance inside a life that you used to just like wander through easily and seamlessly and made sense to you. And the pillar people and the pillar relationships and communities and experiences, like they see you and relate to you differently. And you're just like grasping for that sense of where am I and who am I? And like, I need life to feel normal again. And it's just, yeah, it's like I wanted almost like a balm or something to soothe the chaos that came with the duality.
Such a beautiful articulation. Really well done. Duality piece is a really hard one to describe, but yet so many people, I'm sure, as they're listening to this, they're shaking their heads like, yeah, that makes sense to me. So thank you, Stephenie. Wow, that's some powerful images and powerful statements. And I think you stumped me as far as where I'm going to go from here because I just want to sit and ponder that because it's so beautiful. But I will say, if there's anything, I'm curious, throughout your grief journey, was there really like a specific emotion or feeling that stood out for you as far as like kind of a common theme throughout day-to-day struggle and strife and finding your way?
Yeah. There was a lot of, I guess this isn't so much an emotion. There's a lot of disorientation for sure. And for me, because of the events that led up to his death and his passing, the way that I found out, like the way that everything happened, I had a tremendous amount of guilt. And I learned very quickly in spending time, especially with his parents and his family after he passed, and hearing what they were hearing from everyone around them, how common with suicide loss the guilt is. And to an extent that you wouldn't expect, like, I think it would make sense to most people that I would feel guilt, that his parents would feel guilt, anyone close to him or involved in his day-to-day life. But I heard stories about, he was a woodworker and he was trying to commission these really tiny screws for these really super cool tools he was making. And the person that he asked was like a friend of the family in an extended way. And this person was busy and never got back to him. And to hear that that person felt guilt, like, what if I had just done that a little more quickly, was soothing in a way and also really confusing at the same time. But guilt was something that took me a long time to process. And, I don't know how many people in your audience have suicide loss, but that sticks with you for such a long time of what could I have done differently? And it's almost 8 years since he passed at this point. And I am finally, I would say, at a place where I can say that I don't feel responsible. I don't feel guilty. Maybe if I had done something differently, he would have lived another week or, whatever. But, and I can also honor the fact that, of course, I felt guilt to begin with, because whether or not I was to blame, which I'm not, I was a part of the equation for him. And so I think that there's something that's really important when it comes to grief of all kinds, and dark and twisty, heavy, traumatic, all these deeper, darker things that we go through. And especially with someone who has suicide loss, like, not invalidating ourselves. I felt that guilt so intensely, and that was such a common theme for many, many years, like several years. And it was never enough for me. Like, it never felt supportive or healing when people were just like, it's not your fault and here's why. Because I got to a point where I could see it wasn't my fault, but I needed that acknowledgement still that I was a part of the equation. Like, it was normal and okay for me to have felt that guilt. And I would guess most of your audience, most grievers, know that grief is this like crazy, chaotic concoction of all these emotions, some of which don't make any sense at all. Like, my rage after he died made no sense to me. I was so mad the day after I learned that he had left me here alone. Like, that was the exact thought that I had. And I was like, what is that even about? This is someone I probably would have never seen again. And I would rage at the night sky when little things like a James Bond commercial came on, because it was his favorite movie. And I would like yell at the sky, like, didn't you realize you would never see these again? So the concoction of emotions and the rage made no sense to me for a long time. And that was consistent in an inconsistent way. Like, it would come up, over time, but it wasn't perpetual. But yeah, the guilt and the weight of the guilt, like woven into the deep sense of loss, the deep sense of sadness, the heartbreak. It was just, the guilt was very weighty.
Thank you. If it's okay to ask, would you share just a couple coping mechanisms or things you reached for to help process that guilt?
I don't know where this instinct came from, but I'm really glad that it was there. And it might have been that I have a relationship to emotions, and it might have been that I had been doing personal development work, but I actually would just feel everything fully. And the way that I kind of describe it now is, it's like I took up the habit of hurting myself, not physically, but emotionally. Like, if something triggered my grief, if I found, for example, I found his beanie like months after he died. If that triggered my grief, most people would be like, take it away, get it out of here, like pat on the back, let's get back to it. And I would like hold that thing, and I would remember every memory of him in it, and like feel every feeling about it. And I would like bottom out in the sadness or the guilt or the rage, like whatever was there. And again, I can't say why that was. It was just very instinctual. And I was so positive that feeling those feelings would consume me. Like, if I went into them fully and I didn't distract myself and I didn't try to soothe myself with something else, like, it, even though logically I knew it wouldn't happen, like, I felt so sure that it was just going to consume me and I was just going to disappear. I was just going to cease to exist because the grief was so big. But I still kept doing it. And it was almost like, and I kind of wonder, just having answered your question about guilt, if it was related to the guilt, like if I felt like I needed to punish myself, maybe. But it was also one of the best things that I could have ever done. So it was one thing that I did very instinctually. And then something I did, which I think was partly my PTSD, because I had no sense of time, I had no point of reference, was I stayed perpetually in motion. And I gravitated towards situations that were unusual for me. Like, I'm not a drinker, and I would go out drinking and dancing until late at night. I fell head over heels in love with a drug addict who was abusive, and I would get on the back of his motorcycle with no second seat when I knew he had been drinking. It was like this weird, the duality again, of I could feel everything so much and it hurt so bad, and yet I was fighting so hard to feel something at the same time. So I was definitely a bit reckless, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Rightfully so. I think that, I don't want to do a disservice to your experience, but I just think that so much emotion is so overwhelming when you're trying to make sense of what's not sensible. And so just some of these life experiences for you are just, I think, profound. And, I think we started the conversation by you sharing about a little bit more about loving and or being comfortable of working with people who are in the dark and twisty. And so, that there's a familiarity there, and so, like, in my projection, Stephenie, there's this piece where it's like, hey, here's a new part of dark and twisty for me. Like, let's explore that, because life fucking sucks right now, or something like that. Or, I can't make sense of like this shitstorm of grief. It's it's just, I really think that's very common, and I'm just deeply grateful to you for sharing so much of like the details of some of this process that you endured, as you know, you found your way after losing your partner, your ex-partner, and it's just powerful indeed, because you and I are engaging in the type of conversation that people really want to hear. They really want to hear what's real. They really want to hear what's authentic. And I think you and I have opened up a door to that. And so I thank you for trusting our space, for having that conversation. And I really, I really don't want to delve more into like your personal process. I'd love to learn about the work you do. So I guess I just have to ask, like, is there in what you're doing now, is that helping people who are in the dark and twisty?
Absolutely. And those are my favorite people, like I was telling you, for so many reasons, partly because that's how I identify. Like I said, I was very depressed and suicidal teenager, and the loss that I went through and the trauma of it and the journey that I went on after it was so awful. And so just like ripe with all of the horrible experiences and emotions that you can feel. And so I have a personal relationship to it. But there's something about being cracked open by these experiences that I find so beautiful. And it's never that I'm like, oh, yay, look at you going through the worst time of your life. Isn't this great? Because I know how much it sucks, and I know how frustrating it is and how impossible it feels and overwhelming, and just like you don't know who you are anymore and you're trapped inside your own life. Like there's just so much to it. But I've learned from my own experience that there's so much fertile ground in our rock bottoms because we have been cracked open. And that doesn't mean, I think it's really important to talk about, like, because what I teach and what I did for myself and the work that I do with my clients is very much about stepping more deeply into who you are and really creating alignment in your life, and like reorienting to everything about yourself and your relationships and your work, and becoming more of yourself in the process. And I think it's very easy, especially when we're in it, because this is how I heard it, to hear that as like those frustrating comments and conversations of like, everything happens for a reason. And especially the ones that are like, you had a divine agreement to go through this, and like make the most out of it and make meaning out of it. And I don't agree with that personally. I know everyone has different beliefs. Like I personally do not care if my ex and I had some kind of divine agreement to go through this together. And I don't ever think about his death in the way of it was so meaningful, like it shaped me and it made me who I am and it created all these beautiful things. Like, I think it's really important to acknowledge how messed up these experiences are and how much they destroy us and how awful they are and how insanely challenging they are to come back from in any capacity. So I don't feel, again, like it was so meaningful and it was divinely orchestrated and I'm a better person because he died. And at the same time, we're so cracked open by these experiences, and the way that we're wired as human is to make meaning. So when we can start to separate out, it's not that the loss itself was this magical meaningful experience. It's something awful that happened, and I will always relate to it that way. There will always be grief about it. I will never be glad that he's dead. And when I'm ready, I can choose the meaning that I want to make in the aftermath of this, like the life that I want to live, the person that I want to become. And I actually completely forgot your question.
I don't really know. It doesn't matter. I forgot it too. But
Oh, it was the dark and twisty piece.
yeah, but I tell you what, you've addressed it, and I feel like it's all good. Let's just roll with it. What I'm thinking about now, Stephenie, is, there's well, I'm thinking about you, because I'm hearing, obviously not in the words you're saying, but again, in my projection, so forgive me if I'm way off the cuff, But I'm hearing there's a huge commitment to your personal development, and there's a huge commitment to you being very personally reflective and giving yourself time and space to continuously check in about like, hey, where am I at? Where am I at now? How do I feel about this? Where do I want to be? What are my possible, what are my options? You probably have different terminology for it all, but again, Reid's projection here, apologies for that. I just think you're very personally reflective, and I think that it's an advantage. I just don't know how else to say it, but it's an advantage to have these qualities for healing, for healing's sake. And I'm thinking about grieving, and as far as like getting to a point where nobody feels like grief completely runs their life. It's like, okay, now I recognize I have some damn choices to make. And so I'm going to choose what help may bring a little bit more light in my day or a little bit more joy, because that now feels authentic, whereas before it didn't. And so tying into this advantageous aspect of the personal reflection, I'm just curious, like, have you attracted people who perhaps, how I don't want to compare, but I just don't know how else to phrase it, Stephenie, but have you attracted people who just don't seem as self-aware and they may need a little bit more guidance or prompts?
I have in my personal relationships, I think, more than professionally. I do definitely have people in my audience or even who work with me that, and yeah, not to compare, it's like they're just at a different stage with that. And I feel like there are so many reasons for that. Like there's no judgment there, because there was a time that I wasn't as self-aware. There were times I couldn't be as self-aware because of my trauma or because grief was all consuming or my life was in shambles after all of it. And I have found that one of my, and I think I shared this before, one of my gifts is being able to give language to things, because I have my own very like intimate, and maybe to others it probably seems a little over the top, relationship with my emotions and my experiences and making sense of them. And so I have learned how to talk about a lot of the concepts that I teach, or the work that we have to go through, the process that we have to go through, especially with healing and grief. Like I have learned how to meet people where they're at and describe things in such a way that it normalizes it. And I think that that's really important, because part of why it can be so hard for us to self-reflect is even because of like our childhood trauma and experiences and our subconscious programming and the limiting beliefs that we've grown up with, the fears that we have. And then when you add something like grief to the mix, your brain is just not working the way that it worked before. And so it's very hard to see what's going on, and life is completely disorienting. And, a lot of my clients have definitely had loss or trauma. I tend to attract them because I share my experience and I speak to it so much. And so they gravitate towards me because of that. And I have just learned that there are some people that choose not to be self-aware. There's some people that simply aren't there yet in this lifetime or on the journey that they're on. And then there are a lot of legitimate reasons why we can't be. And if we can normalize the conversations to where people aren't getting spun out in, well, I can't do what Stephenie's doing because I'm too broken, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not good enough. It's just like, I like to simplify things into processes and into languaging that just makes it make sense and makes it normal, because then it's easier for our brains to latch onto and be like, oh, of course I haven't been as self-reflected. I'm in this stage of grief and I'm feeling all these things. And again, even the way I described it for me, the ground has shifted beneath my feet. Like I just really like to give language to that, because then it makes it easier for our broken, grieving, hurting brains, like completely rewired and on the fritz brains and grief, to latch on and be like, oh, this is what's going on for me. And then you can slowly step into more of that self-awareness.
Fantastic. And you mentioned just a snippet about like developing processes, and if it's okay, I'm going to call it programming too, some processes and some programming to help with your clients. But for clients that have experienced grief-related trauma, as an example, is there a specific process that comes to mind that you invite them to engage in, or you at least introduce them to?
Yeah, and I work very differently with all my clients, and I think that's important for anyone who's looking for any kind of support, is find someone who will meet you where you're at and who can work with you in a way that honors who you are as a person and who you're fighting to become as you go through this experience. And one of my processes is journey mapping, and that's based on the hero's journey. Like, you don't even have to do my program, I don't think. I mean, I think my program's great, but you don't even have to do that work with somebody to benefit from something like the hero's journey. And I don't know if you ever talk about the hero's journey in your work, but it's a narrative pattern created by Joseph Campbell, and it's the framework at the core of every story, every myth, every movie, every book. And I started studying the hero's journey when I was like 6 or 7 months into my grief journey. And it was so helpful for me because it helps you orient yourself to where you are on your grief journey. And that doesn't mean that like you're going to have a light bulb moment and be like, I'm all better now, I just need to do this one thing. But it really helped me personally to see, oh, I'm like in the deep underbelly of the journey. Like, I am at death and rebirth right now, or I'm at the part where I have to choose to, return to the normal world, and I'm learning the lessons. And it was this map for what I was going through that just helped me orient. And I think that that's really important for anyone who's deep in their grief, at the beginning of it, in the messy middle of it, like wherever you are in it. We need to anchor somehow. And we can anchor when we can create a map. And I do not believe, I was telling you this, I don't believe in blueprints. I believe in processes and frameworks that give us the bones to move how we need to. And so looking at the hero's journey or doing something like journey mapping, whatever it is, like being able to orient to, oh, I'm at this part of the journey, helps you start to get a sense of where you can focus your energy and your time and your intention to continue moving forward. And for me personally, like, I was so caught in a grief loop. And it was would have been November. So it was 11 months after my loss. I felt like I was stuck and I was never going to get out of grief. Like, I was just always going to be broken and grieving. I would never have a normal life. I would never have a brain again. I would never like make money or have a business because everything had fallen apart. And I took out the book I was reading to study the hero's journey. And I was at the part where it's the second ordeal. And so this is the part in movies where it's like they've killed off the bad guy and they're getting away, but the bad guy comes back and now you have to fight to the death again, or you're in that final car chase scene of the movie. It's like the second ordeal, the second coming of the big battle, the big obstacle. And in just reading about that, and this book was very much about writing screenplays using the hero's journey. So it wasn't about healing at all, but it helped me see, oh, this is where I am. Like, I'm looping because I'm at the part where I actually have to choose to rise up and come back. Like, I have to make the choice now. It doesn't just happen automatically. It's something I have to choose. And that didn't mean it was easy. It didn't mean that I chose it the next day. And choosing it at first for me looked like a lot of very small steps. Like, I'm going to get out of bed today. I'm going to shower. I'm going to cry my way to the gym and make a lap around the gym and then cry my way back home and not do anything there. Like, the choosing of it was really difficult for me. And I think it is for everyone. And we don't talk about that enough. So we think that we're not cut out for it because it's hard, but the choosing to rise up is the hardest part of the journey. And so that process is one that I use either directly through the curriculum that I've created or just in how I work with people. It's like, let's orient you to where you are. And it doesn't necessarily make you feel better, but it gives you this sense of where you've come from, what's different now, so that you can start to like relax your brain a bit and anchor back into yourself. And then when you're ready, you can start to think about, well, what needs to happen if I want to move out of this, if I'm ready to move out of this?
It sounds awesome. I like the idea of a map because, quite honestly, most of the people I talk to who are deeply grieving the first thing they'll say is, I'm lost. So they're really seeking like some sense of direction. And I think, yeah, it's metaphorical, but at the same time, a map provides that. And so I also think of a map, playing off this analogy or this metaphor, that when given a map, there's trail markers. And so I'm curious, like how many trail markers are on the map of it's journey mapping? Is that what it's
Journey
called?
mapping, yeah.
Journey mapping.
Yeah, so there's 12, and there's 12 within the hero's journey as well, Joseph Campbell's framework, and my 12 are different. Like the hero's journey, I feel like itself paints you a picture of what a journey looks like and what the different parts and pieces are. And what I've developed is how do we actually move through those? And so there's 12 of them. And obviously within those, there's a lot more work to be done. And to what you were saying, one of the aspects of what I teach, and that was really helpful for me to learn for myself, was this process of reorienting. Like not only do you create the map, but you have to reorient to who you are after your loss and who you're becoming, because that's constantly changing. And you have to reorient to your life and your relationships. And once we reorient, and this is like a constant process, like this work is exhausting and challenging. And that's why a lot of people don't do it, is because you start and it's hard and you think you're not cut out for it, but it's supposed to be hard. So you're reorienting to everything. And as you reorient, you have to either renegotiate things or release them. And for me, there was a lot of release at first because I didn't have the skill yet to renegotiate. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted. But there was a lot of going, I can't be the person that I was before in this relationship. I can't be the teacher, the coach, the writer, the whatever I was before in my business. I can't show up in the same way in this space. I can't meet these same expectations. And so that is one of, I think, the most important like markers and milestones and aspects. And it's so challenging. It can be really challenging to do by yourself because, again, everything around you is the same for the most part. And people want to relate to you the way that they did before. And all the expectations are still there. And your job is probably the same. And, there's so much about your life that just continues despite your grief. And so it's like this constant check-in every moment of every day. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't like it here anymore. I don't feel like myself here anymore. I can't be your friend in this way anymore. I can't be your partner. And it's scary because it leads to more loss in a lot of ways. But as we do that, we get to know who we are better and better, and we get to start to shift our trajectory and where we're headed to match that.
Got one word for you. Ashe. That is, unfortunately, I don't know the exact source of it, but I learned it in a African spirituality class. And it just is like, yeah, girl.
I love that. Ashe.
Ashe.
Is that what you said?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, there's definitely a lot more to learn about your journey mapping and process. It sounds really awesome. And I think you said to me pre-recording that you really focused on being holistic about it. So can you give us a little snippet of like how this program is holistic, or this process is holistic?
Yeah. So for me, the holistic piece is to address all parts. And part of that is knowing yourself and who you are. So everything that I do in my work immediately answers the question that I think at least I've had when I've hired people or worked with them in any capacity, like, why should I trust you? Why should I listen to you? And my answer to that is always, you shouldn't. You should trust yourself. Like, you should move through any experience, including mine, from a place of, does this feel right for me? So I immediately start everything that I do, even journey mapping, when you're like at the depths of your dark and twisty and you don't know yourself anymore, is bring you back into alignment and bring you back into that relationship with yourself and your intuition and your ability to discern, because you can't do this work however you choose to do it if you don't have the ability to discern what's right and wrong for you, because you're actively going against like what everyone expects from you, the life that you built before. Like when you start to really heal and realign yourself in your life, there's so much pushback. There's so many people that just want you to be who you were before. And so if you don't have the ability to tune in and discern what's right for you, it's just going to be a mess, a disaster, and you're going to get pulled off course constantly. So I start with that. Like if anything I say throughout this process doesn't resonate with you, that's awesome. Like trust yourself. So rebuilding that trust. And everything I do, I address subconscious programming because it comes into play with everything. Our subconscious mind is the only thing that's online until we're about 5 to 7. So we have no ability to accept or reject information. And we form these strategies for survival that don't serve us. And we have this winning strategy, especially that's how we have learned to stay safe and secure and successful and get love and belonging. And because grief changes us so drastically at our core, and for a lot of people, myself especially, like in an instant, that strategy no longer serves you, and you don't even know that it's there influencing you. So it's really hard for you to come home to yourself and to trust yourself and to discern what's right for you and to reorient and completely maybe reorganize your entire life if you're not aware of the pieces on a subconscious level that will try to get you to stop, that want to keep you safe by keeping you in the known and familiar. So that's a piece. And then process work. I'm a big advocate for process work, whatever that looks like for people. That can be something like journaling, that can be something like talking it through. But there's so many different modalities that I use that I was like so blessed to be able to receive from other practitioners, ways of processing the stored emotions out of our bodies and our cells. And you and I talked about this before the recording, and I feel very passionate about it. None of this work can be intellectual. There is a certain amount of leverage that we get when we understand things about ourselves, about our grief, about the processes, about the work, the subconscious. But understanding isn't what gets us to where we want to be. It's the actual living of the work, the embodying it, the making it part of our paradigm and our worldview. And it's removing anything stored in your cells and your body that keeps you from being able to do that. And so I bring energy and process work into everything that I do. And I have worked with people on some really devastating traumas. And what gave me my brain back was a mentor of mine doing my first process on me. So I know what it's like to do the work, and I know how hard it is. And I love to meet people in that space, because when you choose to do the processing work, however you choose to do it, like you're choosing to be free of something. And I think that can be scary when we're grieving, especially if it's someone that we loved. Like there's something about our grief that we feel at times, at least for me, keeps us connected to that person. And so I think sometimes it can be really scary to think about, well, if I heal, am I just going to forget them? Am I not going to care anymore? Am I not going to remember? And I can tell you for sure that that won't happen. You will just have more space and freedom in yourself to navigate life again, to rebuild your life with a relationship to your grief and to your loss, however you want it to be. But it's that like heaviness that we can start to lighten, and we can just you can just gain more freedom and leverage and space to really move through your life differently. And so that's something I preach. However you choose to do your grief work, make sure there is some way of like you're actually removing what's stored in you out of your body.
I tell you what, it's wonderful to hear the passion in your voice. It's wonderful to hear your passion as you describe everything you're bringing to people in need. Your heart's in the right place. I couldn't feel more confident in saying that. So as people, listening, want to learn more about the offerings you share, where do you want them to connect with you? Where do they find you?
So just my main website, stepheniezamora.com. I spell my name special, STEPHENIEZAMORA. And that just it's the hub. It's where you can find anything that you might need. And something I shared with you, it's really important to me that the work is accessible. So there's lots of free stuff, lots of content, lots of opt-ins and different options to go deeper into the work.
Wonderful. Well, it's been an awesome conversation. I hope that in the future we pick up where we left off. Stephenie, thanks for being a part of Grief Refuge.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Like truly, I said this to you, I wish that this had been around during my grief journey, and the work that you're doing is so incredible and important. So thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the full interview. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and all the stories and experiences shared here on this podcast. Grief and healing, it's really important work. And although it's painful at times, it's really worth it for helping to heal your heart, your mind, and your soul. Remember that if you need more support right now, please download the Grief Refuge app right now. It's a helpful tool, and it's full of content. Matter of fact, daily content to help comfort and support you through this difficult time. Please search for Grief Refuge on your phone's app store now. Also, I invite you to leave me a rating and review. I really value your feedback, and I listen to it. My team, we want to make sure that Grief Refuge and this podcast best serve your needs. So the more you let us know, the better we can provide. And how we get to know is by reading your rating and review. So please rate and review the Grief Refuge podcast on your favorite podcast player. Thank you. Take care. Keep honoring your grief. Keep listening to your heart. Be kind to yourself. And talk to you soon.